If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Snow pressed into dirty slush around the half-ruined farmhouse that served as the Allied outpost. Weak daylight filtered through the winter clouds, giving the valley a dull, cold look. Shell holes filled with frozen water marked the ground. The barn doors no longer closed properly, and the roof of the farmhouse sagged in two places. It looked like a place abandoned months ago, not defended by living men. Staff Sergeant Elias Ward, 33, stepped out into the yard with a cup of cold coffee. His uniform was worn, the edges of his gloves frayed from constant use. He had stopped noticing the smell of wet wood and burned fuel weeks ago. His eyes tracked the valley, slow, steady, calculating. He always watched before speaking. That habit came from years of field work and from the accident that shaped his life. A failed rescue attempt during a mission in Italy that cost his younger brother his life. Since then, Elias rarely spoke unless necessary, and he avoided forming attachments. Silence felt safer. Elias and the remaining 6 soldiers had been sent to hold this sector until reinforcements arrived. The official mission was simple on paper: keep the road from falling into German hands and act as an early warning point for any major offensive. The reality was different. Supply lines had collapsed under weeks of snowstorms. Illness had taken 3 men. Shelling had driven the rest into the farmhouse. Command had pushed forward to other sectors and left this place behind. Now, the outpost functioned more as a checkpoint than a defensive line. Inside, the men argued in low voices about food, about rations, about orders that never came. One cleaned his rifle on a crate. Another wrapped a scarf around his neck, coughing every few minutes. Morale was low, and everyone knew it. Elias didn't add to their conversations. He remained near the doorway, listening, monitoring the tension, judging how much fight the group had left. A part of him expected them to give up the position, yet another part refused to leave. The mission still mattered, even if headquarters seemed to have forgotten it. If the Germans advanced unchecked, towns behind them would fall without warning. He reminded himself of that every morning. Stay put. Hold the line. Delay whatever comes. Those were the last instructions they had received, and Elias treated them as a personal obligation. He rubbed his gloved hands together, trying to get some warmth back into his fingers. Fear was present, but it was an organized fear, controlled and familiar. Elias had carried it since Italy, and the feeling rarely left him. He used it the way other soldiers used instinct. The collapse. A sudden crack echoed through the valley. Artillery, but not a direct hit. Elias turned toward the road. Dust shot upward from the remains of a small stone shelter used by local civilians. The roof had caved in, and broken beams stuck out at odd angles. For a moment, no one moved. The others hesitated, unsure if more rounds were coming. Elias didn't wait. He dropped the cup and ran down the slope. His boots slid in the mud, but he pushed forward. As he reached the shelter, he could hear coughing beneath the rubble, faint, strained, human. He moved broken stones one at a time, working quickly but carefully. His thoughts tightened into a single line of focus: don't lose another life. His hands shook a little, not from fear, but from the memory of the last time he had dug through rubble and found his brother too late. Finally, under a half-collapsed beam, he saw a young woman trapped on her side. Her clothes were torn, her hair covered in dust, and her breathing shallow. Blood darkened the fabric above her ribs. "Stay with me," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I'm getting you out." She blinked slowly, trying to understand his words. Fear showed in her eyes, fear mixed with exhaustion and disbelief. Elias wedged a piece of wood under the beam and lifted. The pressure sent a jolt through his arms, but he held it long enough to drag her clear. When he lifted her, she gasped in pain, her hand gripping his sleeve. She was colder than he expected. Too cold. Claire Morel. Back at the farmhouse, the men stared as Elias pushed through the door with the woman in his arms. Her name was Claire Morel, 26, a French resistance courier. Once they laid her on the table, she forced herself upright long enough to speak. Her accent was thick, her voice cracking with each word. She explained that her network had been destroyed by German security forces 2 days earlier. She had been trying to reach an Allied signal point with intelligence when a shelling hit the shelter. Her mission wasn't just survival. She carried information the Allies needed: enemy troop locations, radio frequencies, and planned movements in the region. Elias listened carefully. While bandaging her injuries, he kept his voice steady. "You're safe here," he said, though he wasn't fully sure of that. "We'll keep you with us until command responds." She nodded weakly. He could see her trying to stay alert, try to hold herself together after losing her entire cell. He recognized the look. It was the same one he had worn after Italy. The look of someone trying to stay useful so grief wouldn't crush them. The approaching threat. Later, as Claire rested against folded blankets, distant movement caught Elias's eye through the window. Troops, far away but organized. German uniforms. Vehicles hidden behind the tree line. His chest tightened. The Germans weren't scouting. They were preparing for a push. If their outpost fell without warning, the Allied line behind them would be exposed. One of the soldiers muttered, "We can't hold against that." Elias didn't answer immediately. He studied the valley, the fog, the stone walls, the barn, the way sound traveled. His mind shifted into a calm, controlled mode. Every detail mattered now. If they stayed, they needed more than bullets to survive. Claire looked up at him from her blankets, her eyes following his focus. She understood before anyone else did that he was calculating something. "Are we leaving?" she asked softly. Elias shook his head. "No, not yet." He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew one thing. If they abandoned the outpost, the valley would fall. If they stayed, they needed a plan the Germans would never expect. The chapter closes with Elias standing in the doorway, cold air hitting his face, listening to the distant German movement as the weight of responsibility settles on him. Again, heavier than before. He feels fear, but not the kind that freezes him. It sharpens him, and he begins forming the idea that will decide all their lives. Fog thickened over the valley as night took control, hiding the ridges and the tree line in a pale, shifting haze. Inside the farmhouse, the air settled into a tense stillness. No one spoke unless necessary. The men checked their rifles, adjusted their jackets, and searched the darkness outside for movement. Every sound, every creak in the wood, every gust of wind felt sharper than usual. Elias stood near the window with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the faint shapes moving beyond the fog. He watched the Germans in silence, studying how they grouped, how they advanced, how cautious they seemed. Their numbers were still unclear, but their formation told him enough. This was a push, not a patrol. He forced his breathing to stay even. Fear was there, but he controlled it. The outpost had almost no ammunition left, and the men were exhausted after weeks of cold, hunger, and shelling. Claire's arrival added another layer he hadn't expected. She was wounded, she carried crucial intelligence, and she had no chance of surviving a retreat. Everything around him demanded a decision that couldn't be reversed once made. Claire sat on the blankets near the wall, her face pale but alert. She watched Elias as he analyzed the valley. She could read the tension in his shoulders, the calculation behind his eyes, the restraint in his voice whenever he gave a quiet instruction to the other soldiers. "What will happen to us?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Elias didn't turn. "They'll reach the ridge before midnight. If they move on us, we won't stop them with force." He let the words settle before continuing. "So we won't try." Claire's brow tightened. "Then what do we do?" He finally faced her. "We make them believe we're stronger than we are. Strong enough that attacking us costs too much." She absorbed that slowly. It wasn't a boast or a fantasy. His tone was practical, measured. She could tell he had already weighed every alternative and discarded everything that risked immediate collapse. The other soldiers gathered around as Elias walked them through the plan. His instructions were clear, organized, and calm. He assigned each man to a firing position, ordered them to shift locations constantly, and timed the movement of lanterns to create wandering silhouettes in the windows. He wanted the farmhouse to look occupied by dozens of soldiers moving in rotations. He directed voices to echo through the building at intervals. Fake commands, called for non-existent reinforcements, coordinated movements that didn't exist. Claire watched the transformation with growing awareness. Elias had been silent when she first met him, but now she saw a man who understood how fear and confusion operated in battle. She saw how his mind processed terrain, sound, lighting, and timing. Every detail had purpose. When he checked her bandage again, she whispered, "You've done something like this before." He hesitated for a moment. "Not exactly, but I've seen how quickly a line collapses when the enemy believes they're outnumbered. Tonight we used that against them." There was no pride in his voice, only certainty. Outside, German shapes moved cautiously through the fog. Their footsteps sounded faint but steady. The valley carried their presence like a warning. The men in the farmhouse gripped their rifles more tightly, waiting for Elias's signal. Claire shifted in her blankets, her pulse rising as she listened to the distant commands in German. She didn't ask whether the plan would work. She didn't need reassurance. Elias's steadiness grounded her more than promises would. He took one last look across the valley, then closed the farmhouse door softly. "All right," he said. "We start when they get close enough to hear us." The lanterns were placed. The firing points were ready. The men took their positions. Fog swallowed the world outside. Then the first German voices reached the farmyard. Elias nodded once. The bluff began. The bluff unfolded the moment German boots pressed deeper into the fog. The first echo of their movement reached the farmhouse, carrying the heavy rhythm of disciplined marching. Elias gave a short signal with his hand, and the men immediately shifted into the positions he had assigned. The interior of the farmhouse changed from cold stillness to controlled activity. Quiet footsteps crossing the upper floor, lanterns sliding from one window to another, doors opening and closing in steady intervals. The first rifle shot cracked from the barn loft, a clean, single round. A few seconds later, another came from the farmhouse's second floor. Both shots were spaced just enough to sound like two separate squads testing distance and visibility. The Germans halted. Elias listened carefully, judging their reaction through tone and movement. They were unsure. Hesitation carried differently than confidence, and he knew the difference. Inside, no one spoke beyond faint whispers. Claire watched from her corner, gripping the blanket with her good hand. She stayed near the lantern Elias had placed beside her, keeping her silhouette indistinct. The plan depended on the enemy thinking the farmhouse held at least 50 soldiers. A wounded civilian woman, if spotted, would break that illusion instantly. One of the men ran down the stairs, fired 2 rounds from behind the stone wall, then sprinted back up to the loft as instructed. Without coordination, the sequence would have seemed chaotic. Under Elias's structure, it sounded like soldiers rotating positions with discipline. Claire's eyes followed Elias constantly. She noticed how he moved, quiet steps, controlled breathing, checking every corner of the room before passing through. The listeners might have wondered why he was so calm while facing overwhelming numbers. That calmness wasn't natural. It came from habit, built through years of surviving unpredictable situations. He used to fear the same way a craftsman uses a tool, not to freeze, but to sharpen reaction. Outside, German voices rose. Orders were exchanged, short, clipped, uncertain. Elias leaned slightly toward the window. He caught a few words in German that suggested the enemy believed they were facing a reinforced position. The deception was working faster than he expected. He motioned to one of the soldiers near the east wall. "Rotate again. Make it sound like they're preparing the machine gun team." The man nodded and took 2 others with him. They stomped heavily on the wooden floorboards on purpose, creating the weight of more men moving. The floor carried the sound through the farmhouse and outward into the fog. Claire exhaled slowly. "Will they attack?" she whispered. "They don't want to get trapped by an unseen force," Elias answered quietly. "If they think we're dug in, they'll hesitate." The men followed the routine for nearly an hour, firing in short bursts, shifting positions, repeating fake commands. Elias had anticipated a possible gap. Listeners might question, how could such a small group keep the illusion alive without tiring too quickly? He addressed it by rotating responsibilities. No one fired or shouted for long. Every man had breaks built into the sequence, giving them enough time to catch their breath before taking the next point. Fatigue still pressed on them. Claire saw it in their posture and the shake in their hands. She saw it in Elias's eyes as well, though he tried to hide it. He forced himself to remain steady because any sign of collapse from him would ripple through the entire group. The fog deepened, and another German unit advanced along the ridge. Their silhouettes flickered between the trees, barely visible. Elias's stomach tightened. If this group moved too far to the right, they might realize how few defenders occupied the ground. He crouched beside Claire. If you hear anything behind us, anything, say it immediately. They may try to flank. She nodded, her jaw clenched. She focused all her attention on the rear wall and the stretches of darkness beyond it, determined not to let him down. A sudden German flare cut across the sky, turning the fog bright white. Elias's heart jolted. He grabbed the two nearest men and pointed toward the barn. Move now. Make silhouettes stay low. They ran, crossing the open space just long enough for the flare to reveal their shadows. From afar, it would look like multiple soldiers reinforcing the barn side. The timing was tight. When the flare dimmed, the world returned to a muted gray. Claire exhaled sharply. Elias steadied himself against the wall. For a moment, he thought the Germans might recognize how few defenders actually existed. But instead of advancing, their formation pulled back slightly. They were convinced more troops were hidden in the fog. The deception held. For now, inside the farmhouse, the men caught their breath. Their clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cold. Ammunition was nearly half gone. Elias counted the remaining rounds, and Claire saw him push down a flash of concern before it could reach his voice. "How much longer can we do this?" she asked. "As long as it takes," he said. "If they doubt us long enough, they'll break." His tone was low, steady, and certain. Not because he believed survival was guaranteed, but because that certainty was the only thing holding the group together. Another wave of movement echoed through the valley. The Germans were regrouping. Their voices grew louder, less confident, more frustrated. They argued in the distance, unable to understand the scale of what they were facing. Elias looked out into the fog again, watching for the smallest change. "We keep going," he said. "They're not sure what they're dealing with. That's the advantage we hold." He gave another signal, and the men moved to new points in the farmhouse. Lanterns shifted. Footsteps echoed strategically. Shots fired into the empty night. The bluff continued. The valley carried every sound, and the Germans stayed frozen in uncertainty. The waiting had begun. The night stretched into its darkest hours, and the farmhouse had become a machine of controlled noise. Elias listened to every sound outside. The crunch of boots, shifting positions, the muffled clatter of equipment, the clipped German commands passing between officers. The bluff held, but the strain on the defenders was growing heavier with each minute. Inside, the men were exhausted. Their movements were slower now, their breaths loud from running between positions. Sweat mixed with the cold air on their skin, making their uniforms cling to them. Claire watched them with mounting worry. She understood that the listeners might wonder how men already worn down by weeks of hardship could keep going through this endless cycle of firing, running, and shouting. The answer was now visible. Fear sharpened their focus, and Elias's steadiness gave them just enough stability to push themselves past their limits. Elias paused in the entryway, monitoring the fog. "They're testing our flanks," he murmured. "They're looking for weak points. Keep the rotations tight." One of the younger soldiers swallowed nervously. "How long can I keep this up?" "As long as they don't see us clearly," Elias said. "Visibility stays on our side." Claire could see the pressure in his posture. He stood rigid, thinking 3 steps ahead while suppressing the memories that tried to surface. The failed rescue in Italy, his brother trapped under debris, the frantic attempt to cover the retreat. The listeners might have wondered if this night stirred those memories too sharply for him to handle. It did, but in a way that fueled him rather than weakened him. This time he had a chance to prevent another collapse. He refused to lose it. The Germans made their next move. Voices rose from the tree, followed by synchronized footsteps advancing several yards closer. Elias lifted his hand to silence the men. He studied the sound, pinpointing the direction. The advance was cautious, not aggressive. They were probing, not charging. He signaled the firing rotation. 2 shots from the second floor. A shout from a barn. Hold that flank. A lantern swept across a window, casting a moving silhouette across the half-collapsed roof. The echo traveled down the valley, exaggerating the volume of their small force. The Germans paused again. A long moment passed with no sound except the wind shifting the fog. Then a German officer called out sharply, frustrated by the lack of clarity. Claire recognized the tone. "They're not sure if they should commit," she whispered. "That's exactly where we want them," Elias replied. She pulled her blanket tighter, fighting the cold that seeped into her bones. Her wound throbbed with every movement, but she forced herself to stay alert. The listeners might have wondered why she wasn't entirely overwhelmed by pain. Claire understood the stakes. If her attention slipped, the defenders would lose one more set of ears, something they couldn't afford. A sudden crack of branches behind a farmhouse froze everyone. Elias spun toward the rear wall, rifle ready. Claire's pulse spiked. "There," she whispered sharply. Elias moved first. "Rear patrol. They're trying to circle us." He pointed at 2 soldiers. "Take the back window and fire 1 round. Make it loud." They obeyed, leaning out just enough to shoot into the fog. The muzzle flash lit their faces for a heartbeat. The Germans behind a farmhouse scrambled back, startled. "That should hold them off," Elias muttered. But his eyes showed deeper concern. If the enemy discovered the rear was almost undefended, the entire illusion would collapse. The listeners who wondered about the weakest part of the bluff now had their answer. The back of the farmhouse was the most vulnerable point. Elias turned to Claire. "Keep listening behind us. You'll hear them before we do." She nodded, her hands tightening around the blanket. Her breathing steadied despite the fear pushing at her chest. Minutes passed. The bluff continued. Lanterns moved. Shadows shifted. Voices traveled in carefully timed intervals. Every action was designed to hold the enemy in uncertainty. Then something changed. A faint metallic clatter echoed down the valley, metal hitting metal, followed by murmurs among the Germans. Elias tensed. "They're pulling something up," he said quietly. "Probably mortars or a light artillery piece." The men exchanged worried glances. If the Germans fired blindly into the farmhouse, even 1 hit could shatter the bluff and kill them all. "Will they fire?" Claire whispered. "Not if they still think we outnumber them," Elias said. "They won't risk triggering a full response." He stepped outside the doorway, staying low. The cold air bit into his cheeks. Through the fog, he could see shadows rearranging, officers conferring, soldiers shifting nervously. Their body language was clear. Uncertainty was turning into fear. He returned inside. "We push harder," he ordered. "Make it sound like the east wall is reinforced. Give them the impression we're preparing a counterattack." The men sprang into motion again, though fatigue slowed their steps. They stomped across the boards, shouted new commands, fired short bursts that echoed between the ridges. Claire leaned forward, listening to the Germans' reaction. Their voices rose, higher-pitched now, tense. She could almost picture their faces tightening as they tried to read a situation they no longer trusted. A long hour passed. The fog began to shift as early dawn pushed against the night. The pale, cold light seeped through the cracks in the barn wall, revealing silhouettes outside. Hundreds of them. Then it happened. The first German soldier stepped forward with a white cloth in his hand. Another followed. Then another. Elias moved to the window, disbelief flickering in his expression. The German officer shouted something into the fog, and soon dozens more soldiers emerged into the open, rifles held above their heads. The line grew larger by the minute. Claire stared, unable to speak. Her fingers loosened their grip on the blanket. The German officer called out in accented English, "We wish to surrender. Do not fire." Elias let the words sink in. 7 men had held off 700. The bluff had broken the will of an entire battalion. He didn't cheer. He didn't react with triumph. He simply nodded once, his jaw tight with relief and exhaustion. "Hold your positions until they're all visible," he ordered calmly. "We don't move until we know they mean it." The men obeyed, stunned into silence. Outside, German rifles piled on the ground. Officers removed their belts. Soldiers raised their hands higher. The impossible had happened, and dawn was only just beginning. The first full light of dawn spread across the valley, faint and cold, revealing the scale of what had happened. The fog thinned enough to show rows of German soldiers standing in the open, their hands raised, their weapons piled neatly in front of them. 700 men, 7 defenders. Elias stepped out of the farmhouse slowly, his rifle lowered but ready, making sure the surrender was genuine. His breath showed in the cold air as he surveyed the scene with calm, disciplined caution. The listeners might have wondered how the defenders felt in this moment. Fear, disbelief, or triumph. What settled over the group was none of those. It was a heavy, exhausted quiet. No one shouted in victory. No one celebrated. The night had stripped them of the energy for anything other than breathing. Elias turned back to the farmhouse. Claire watched him from the doorway, supporting herself against the frame to keep from collapsing. Her injury ached sharply, but relief softened her face. She had spent the entire night listening for danger. Now she listened to the silence that followed the bluff. It felt unreal, almost hollow. Inside the farmhouse, the men gathered, still stunned. One of them sat on a crate, staring at the Germans outside, as if expecting them to change their minds. Another leaned against a beam, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. The listeners might have wondered whether the defenders feared a trap. Elias addressed that instinct without being asked. "They wouldn't risk a false surrender," he said quietly. "Not after a night like this. They're convinced we outnumber them. They won't break formation." His voice carried authority now, not because he raised it, but because the men finally understood what his calmness had held together all night. A distant engine hum echoed along the valley road. It grew louder. Elias stepped outside again, scanning the ridge. 2 Allied trucks emerged from the thinning fog, followed by a reinforcement column. Allied officers dismounted quickly, their faces tightening with confusion at the sight of the surrendered battalion. The leading officer, an American major, approached Elias. "Who commanded this position?" Elias hesitated. Silence wasn't modesty, it was habit, but the men around him pointed toward him before he could deflect the question. The major studied him for a moment. "You forced their surrender?" Elias answered plainly. "We convinced them there were more of us than there were." The major didn't hide his surprise. How many defenders?" 7. The major turned toward the field of surrendered Germans, then back to Elias with a look halfway between disbelief and respect. "We'll document everything. You'll be recognized for this." Elias didn't respond, not out of disrespect, but because recognition wasn't what kept him standing through the night. Survival was. Protecting Claire was. Preventing another collapse, another failure like Italy, was. Allied soldiers began securing the prisoners, collecting rifles, and escorting officers to trucks. The quiet chaos of military procedure filled the valley. Shouts, commands, and the clatter of equipment replaced the eerie stillness that had ruled for hours. Inside the farmhouse, Claire eased herself onto a chair as a medic examined her wound. She breathed sharply when the bandage was lifted. The medic reassured her with steady words, explaining that she would fully heal with proper care, something she finally had access to now that help had arrived. Elias stepped in beside her. She looked up at him, the fatigue clear in her eyes. "It's over," she said softly. "For now," Elias replied. His voice carried something different, relief mixed with the weight of everything he had held back. But beneath that weight, there was also clarity. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. The listeners might have wondered what would become of Claire, whether she would be forced back into the resistance or she would simply disappear into the chaos of war. The medic addressed the concern without breaking the flow of the scene. "She'll be taken to a medical post. French liaison officers will meet her there. She won't be alone." Elias nodded, relieved but not ready for the separation that was coming. The major re-entered the farmhouse. "Ward, gather your men. You're all being rotated back for debrief and rest." Elias acknowledged the order. The men nearly collapsed with relief. Weeks of fear and hunger were finally ending. Claire watched Elias pack his gear. "Will you leave now?" she asked. He paused. He didn't want her to see hesitation on his face, but she caught it anyway. "They'll take you to safety," he said. "You'll recover. After that, you'll go where you're needed." She studied him silently, understanding the unspoken truth. War would pull them to different paths. Yet something built during that night, through shared danger, silence, and trust, held them in a quiet connection neither of them tried to deny. Before the medics took her, Claire reached out. Elias met her hand halfway. Their fingers held for a moment, steady and wordless. It wasn't a dramatic promise or a desperate farewell. It was two people acknowledging the bond forged between them in the worst hours of the night. "You'll make it through the rest of the war," Claire said softly. "I know you will." He squeezed her hand gently. "You will too." Allied soldiers helped her onto a transport jeep. As it pulled away, Claire looked back at Elias one more time. He stood at the doorway of the farmhouse, tired, bruised, but alive. For the first time since Italy, he didn't look haunted. He looked forward. Weeks later, after medical care and reassignment, Claire found a way to send a message through the French liaison network. A simple request: "When the war ends, meet me in Paris." And Elias, now recognized officially for the bluff that saved the valley, made a promise to himself he never voiced to anyone. He would go. Months passed. The war ended. Paris regained its noise, its movement, its life. On a quiet morning, outside a small station near the Seine, Claire waited, standing, healed, no longer a courier hiding from death, but a woman building a future. Elias stepped off the arriving train moments later. Their eyes met across the platform. He walked toward her. She moved toward him. No fear, no fog, no shadows, only the clear certainty that both had survived the night and everything that came after. The story closed not with tension, but with the quiet relief of two people standing together in peace at last.